It's a cold night in a small Scottish village, sometime in the 1600s, and a woman is being dragged out of her house by torchlight. Her neighbors are shouting. Someone points at her face and screams that her eyes prove it. Green, bright, unusual, glowing green eyes in the torchlight. And in that one moment, in front of an angry crowd, that single detail about her eyes becomes evidence. Evidence that she is a witch. Evidence that she talks to the devil. Evidence that she deserves to be tied up, tried, and possibly killed. Now stop and think about that for a second. A woman's entire fate, her life or her death, decided partly because of the color of her iris. That's not fiction. That's the real weight that green eyes carried for centuries across parts of Europe, especially during the witch trial era in Scotland and other regions, where green eyes were treated as a mark of supernatural power, a sign that a person could cast spells, see the future, or make a deal with dark forces. People feared green eyes. They whispered about them. They avoided looking directly into them for too long, worried that just meeting that gaze could put them under some kind of spell. That's the level of fear one single eye color created for hundreds of years. And here's the wild part. After centuries of superstition, myth, and fear, modern DNA science has finally cracked open the real reason green eyes exist at all, and the answer involves a genetic mutation, an ancient survival advantage, and one of the rarest combinations in the entire human genome. Stay with me, because green eyes are not just rare. They are one of the strangest accidents in human genetic history, and the real story is way more fascinating than any witch legend ever was. Let's start with the basic numbers, because this is where the story really grabs you. Out of the entire population of planet Earth, roughly 8 billion people, only about 2% have naturally green eyes. 2%. That means if you're standing in a crowded room of 100 people, statistically, you might only find 1 or 2 people with true green eyes in that entire room. Compare that to brown eyes, which dominate the planet, making up somewhere between 70 and 80% of the world's population. Brown is basically the default human eye color, found almost everywhere, from Africa to Asia to South America. Blue eyes come in at a distant second, making up roughly 8 to 10% globally, concentrated heavily in Northern and Central Europe. But green sits in this strange, rare little pocket. Rarer than blue, rarer than gray, rarer than almost anything except very unusual conditions like albinism, which can sometimes produce eyes that appear red or violet under certain lighting. So right off the bat, if you have green eyes, you are already part of one of the smallest eye color groups on the entire planet. And once you understand what actually has to happen inside your genes to produce that color, you'll realize just how much of a genetic coincidence it really is. So here's where we get into the science, and I promise I'll keep this simple. Your eye color is not caused by a green pigment or a blue pigment sitting inside your iris. That's actually one of the biggest myths out there. There is no blue pigment in human eyes. There is no green pigment either. The only pigment involved is melanin, the same brown-black pigment responsible for your skin color and your hair color. Melanin is produced and stored inside your iris in varying amounts, and depending on how much melanin you have and where exactly it sits inside the layers of your iris, your eyes end up looking brown, green, blue, gray, or hazel. Brown eyes have a lot of melanin, which absorbs most of the light that hits the iris and gives it that deep, rich brown color. Blue eyes, on the other hand, have very little melanin. What happens with blue eyes is actually a trick of physics, not pigment. With low melanin levels, light passes into the iris, scatters off the collagen fibers inside it, and bounces back out as blue light, the exact same optical effect called Rayleigh scattering that makes the sky look blue. Your eyes aren't blue because of a blue dye sitting in them. They're blue because of how light physically bounces around inside a low melanin iris. Green eyes sit right in the middle of this whole spectrum. They happen when there's a low to moderate amount of melanin combined with a slightly yellowish or golden pigment called lipochrome, or sometimes just a specific balance of melanin distribution, which combines with that same blue scattering effect to produce the green appearance. It's basically a rare, delicate mixture, low pigment plus scattering plus a touch of yellow tone, all lining up together. And if any of those pieces shift even slightly, you end up with hazel or gray or blue instead of true green. Now let's talk about the genes actually responsible for this, because this is where the real DNA detective work comes in. Scientists have identified 2 major genes sitting right next to each other on chromosome 15 that control most of human eye color variation. They're called OCA2 and HERC2. OCA2 is the gene most directly responsible for producing melanin, and it accounts for something like 75% of the variation in human eye color on its own. But right next to OCA2 sits HERC2, and HERC2 acts like a control switch. It doesn't produce pigment itself, but it contains a section that regulates how active OCA2 is allowed to be. Think of OCA2 as a light bulb and HERC2 as the dimmer switch sitting right beside it. If HERC2 dials OCA2 all the way up, you get a flood of melanin and you end up with dark brown eyes. If HERC2 dims that switch way down, OCA2 barely produces any melanin at all, and you end up with pale blue eyes. Green eyes require something much trickier. They require the dimmer switch to land in a very specific, narrow middle position, not too bright, not too dark, plus a combination of several other smaller genetic variants scattered across other genes like SLC24A4, TYR, and IRF4, each nudging the final shade one way or another. It's not one single gene flipping one single switch. It's an entire orchestra of genes that all have to land in a very precise combination at the same time. And that is exactly why green eyes are so rare. Brown eyes just need high melanin. Blue eyes just need very low melanin. But green eyes need this narrow, fragile sweet spot in the middle, which is statistically much harder to land on by pure chance. Here's where the story gets even more incredible. Because scientists haven't just figured out how green eyes form biologically, they've actually traced the deep evolutionary history of where light-colored eyes came from in the first place. And the discovery is honestly stunning. Researchers studying the genetics of eye color, including a well-known study led by geneticist Hans Eyberg at the University of Copenhagen, found something remarkable about blue eyes specifically. Every single person on Earth today who has blue eyes appears to share the exact same tiny genetic mutation in that HERC2 regulatory region. Not a similar mutation, the literal same one, which means, according to this research, that every blue-eyed person alive today can trace that specific mutation back to one single common ancestor, one individual, who lived somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, most likely in the region near the Black Sea, in what's now part of southeastern Europe. Before that mutation appeared, scientists believe every human being on the planet had brown eyes. Every single one. Brown was universal. Then, somewhere around 10,000 years ago, this one random genetic copying error occurred in one person's DNA. A tiny switch flip in the HER2 region that dimmed down OCA2 activity, and that mutation didn't just disappear, it spread. Generation after generation, it got passed down, and eventually it spread across huge portions of the European population, eventually leading to the tens of millions of blue-eyed people alive on Earth today, all of them, technically, distant genetic cousins connected through that single ancient ancestor. Now here's the twist that connects directly to green eyes. Green eyes appear to have evolved from that exact same genetic starting point. Once that original light eye mutation appeared and started spreading through ancient European populations, additional smaller mutations began stacking on top of it over the following thousands of years, fine-tuning melanin levels in slightly different directions in different family lines. Some lineages ended up with extremely low melanin and the pure blue scattering effect. Other lineages picked up slightly different combinations of these secondary mutations, landing them in that narrow middle zone that produces green, or landing them in the mixed, speckled combination we call hazel. So green eyes aren't some separate, unrelated genetic branch. They're essentially a more delicate, more complicated variation growing out of the exact same ancient mutation event that originally created blue eyes in the first place, just with extra genetic modifiers layered on top that had to align in a very specific way. And here's a question that scientists have spent years trying to answer. Why did this mutation spread at all? If brown eyes were the original universal human eye color for tens of thousands of years, why would a random genetic accident that produces lighter eyes suddenly start spreading rapidly through entire populations? This is where things get genuinely fascinating, because researchers studying ancient DNA have found something called a selection signal at that exact HERC2 and OCA2 region in the genomes of ancient Europeans. A statistical fingerprint showing that this mutation wasn't just randomly drifting through the population by luck. Something was actively favoring it. Something was making people with lighter eyes more successful at surviving and reproducing than people with darker eyes. And scientists have two competing theories about what that something actually was. The first theory is tied to sunlight and vitamin D. As ancient human populations migrated further north into Europe, away from the equator, they received far less direct sunlight throughout the year. Lower melanin levels in the skin are already known to help people absorb more vitamin D efficiently in low sunlight environments, and some researchers believe a similar pressure may have applied to eye pigmentation as populations adapted to these darker, colder northern regions. The second theory is honestly a lot stranger and a lot more human. Some evolutionary biologists argue that light eyes spread simply because people found them attractive. In an ancient population where dark brown eyes were the overwhelming norm, someone born with strange, pale, unusual colored eyes would have stood out instantly in a crowd. And across many species in nature, rare visually distinctive traits often trigger a mating preference, sometimes for no deeper reason than pure novelty and visual fascination. If ancient humans found these rare, light-eyed individuals more attractive as partners, generation after generation, that preference alone could have been powerful enough to drive this mutation from a single rare accident into a trait carried by hundreds of millions of people today. In other words, it's entirely possible that pure attraction, something as simple as people finding an unusual eye color captivating, is one of the reasons green and blue eyes exist across huge portions of the human population today. There's also a slightly darker theory tied into the same puzzle, one connected not to attraction, but to territory and identity. Some researchers studying ancient European migration patterns have pointed out that as small hunter-gatherer bands spread across the continent after the last ice age, physical markers like unusual eye color or skin tone may have helped distinguish one small tribal group from another at a glance. In the same way certain animal species develop distinct coloring to separate closely related populations. A rare, visually striking trait like a light-colored eye could have functioned almost like a natural signature, helping early human groups recognize members of their own community over generations of contact and conflict with neighboring bands. It's a theory that's harder to prove definitively than the vitamin D or attraction theories, but it adds another layer to just how much scientists are still debating the true evolutionary driver behind this one small genetic switch. Now, let's bring this back to geography, because the distribution of green eyes across the world today tells its own fascinating story. Green eyes are found overwhelmingly concentrated in populations with Northern and Central European ancestry. Countries like Ireland and Scotland report some of the highest percentages of green eyes anywhere on Earth, with some regional estimates suggesting close to a third of the population in these areas may carry green or closely related light hazel eye colors. Hungary is frequently cited as having one of the highest concentrated populations of green-eyed people in continental Europe. Iceland, the Netherlands, and parts of Scandinavia also show notably higher rates of green eyes compared to the rest of the world. Meanwhile, in huge portions of Africa, Asia, and indigenous populations across the Americas, green eyes are almost non-existent, essentially unheard of outside of extremely rare individual mutations or relatively recent European ancestry mixed into a family line. This tight geographic clustering lines up almost perfectly with where that ancient Black Sea region mutation is believed to have spread from and through, following ancient migration routes as populations moved westward and northward into Europe over thousands of years. It's a genetic fingerprint of ancient human movement, hiding in plain sight, in the eye color of millions of people who have no idea their eyes are quietly telling the story of a single ancestor who lived 10,000 years ago. Now let's talk about how this trait actually passes down through families, because this is where a lot of people get genuinely surprised. Eye color used to be taught in basic biology classes as a simple case of one dominant gene and one recessive gene, brown beating blue every single time. But we now know that's a massive oversimplification. Because eye color is polygenic, meaning many genes contribute to the final result, two brown-eyed parents can, in rare cases, still have a green-eyed or even blue-eyed child if both parents happen to be silently carrying some of those recessive lighter eye variants buried underneath their own dominant brown eye genetics. Similarly, two green-eyed parents will usually, though not always, produce green or light-eyed children, since neither parent is contributing a strong dominant brown allele into the mix. This is exactly why eye color can sometimes seem to skip a generation entirely, appearing to vanish in one child and then suddenly reappearing in a grandchild, seemingly out of nowhere. It's not magic. It's just recessive genetic variants quietly hiding in the background of a family tree for a generation or two before the right combination lines up again. There's also a health angle to this story that most people never think about, and it's worth mentioning because it shows that eye color isn't just a cosmetic detail. It can actually reflect small differences in how your body handles light and pigmentation elsewhere too. People with lighter eyes, including green and blue eyes, generally have less melanin protecting the eye from ultraviolet light, which means they tend to be somewhat more sensitive to bright sunlight and glare compared to people with dark brown eyes. Some research has also suggested a possible association between lighter eye color and a slightly higher lifetime risk of certain eye conditions linked to sun exposure, along with a modestly elevated risk of certain skin cancers, since the same underlying genetic pathways that control low melanin in the iris are connected to lower melanin levels in the skin as well. None of this means having green eyes is dangerous or something to worry about day to day. But it is a reminder that this one small genetic quirk that decided your eye color is quietly connected to a much bigger pigmentation system running throughout your entire body. Culturally, green eyes have had an almost obsessive grip on storytelling for centuries, way beyond just the witch trial fears we opened with. Writers have used green eyes as shorthand for jealousy for hundreds of years. The phrase green-eyed monster comes directly from William Shakespeare, who used it in his plays to describe the color of envy. Green eyes have also been used constantly in literature and film to signal mystery, danger, seduction, or otherworldly beauty, from classic novels to modern fantasy franchises, where characters with piercing green eyes are almost always framed as special, magical, or set apart from everyone else around them. Even today, Colored contact lenses remain one of the best-selling non-prescription eye color options, specifically because so many people who were born with brown or blue eyes actively want to experience having green eyes for themselves, driven by decades of cultural messaging that quietly built up green eyes as something rare, desirable, and almost mythical. It's honestly a strange full circle moment when you think about it. An eye color that was once feared enough to get people accused of witchcraft is now something people spend money trying to fake for themselves. Now let's fast forward to the present, because modern genetics has done something these ancient superstitions never could. It's actually let scientists predict eye color directly from a DNA sample, something called forensic DNA phenotyping. Using tools built around markers like that famous HERC2 S&P, known as RS129133832, along with a handful of supporting genetic markers, forensic geneticists can now take a DNA sample, sometimes from something as small as a strand of hair or a trace of blood left at a crime scene, and estimate with a fairly high degree of accuracy what that person's eye color likely was, even without ever seeing the person's face. This technology has actually been used in real criminal investigations, helping narrow down suspect descriptions purely from genetic evidence. Think about how wild that is. A technology that can look at a piece of your DNA and tell investigators with real statistical confidence whether you probably have blue eyes, brown eyes, or that rare green combination, using the exact same genetic region that ancient humans passed down silently for 10,000 years without anyone having the faintest idea it was even there. But even with all this modern science, researchers admit that green eyes remain one of the trickiest colors to predict with total certainty. And that's honestly the perfect way to end this story, because it brings us right back to how genuinely rare and complicated this trait is. Unlike blue eyes, which are strongly tied to that one specific, well-understood genetic switch, green eyes involve enough overlapping genetic variables, melanin amount, melanin distribution, the yellowish lipochrome pigment, and several smaller supporting gene variants, that even the best modern eye color prediction models sometimes struggle to nail it down with complete accuracy. Scientists studying large genetic cohorts, including a major Canadian study analyzing over 5,000 participants of European ancestry, confirmed that while the HERC2 and OCA2 region explains the largest chunk of eye color variation, there are still multiple additional genetic signals scattered throughout the genome that quietly shape the final result, some of them still not fully mapped out even today. In other words, green eyes are still, in some small way, holding on to a little bit of their mystery, even after everything modern DNA science has uncovered. There's one more thing worth sitting with before we close this out, and it's the sheer improbability of the whole thing. For a person to end up with green eyes today, an unbroken chain of extremely specific events had to happen across roughly 10,000 years of human history. First, one random copying error had to occur in one single person's DNA near the Black Sea thousands of years ago. Second, that mutation had to survive, generation after generation, without being lost, spreading slowly outward as populations migrated across Europe. Third, that spreading mutation had to combine in specific family lines with a whole separate stack of smaller genetic variants across multiple other genes, all landing in exactly the right narrow combination needed to produce that middle, in-between green shade rather than sliding all the way to pure blue or staying anchored closer to brown or hazel. And fourth, two parents both carrying pieces of that exact rare combination had to meet, have children, and pass those specific variants down together into one single child. Multiply that improbability across thousands of years and millions of individual family lines, and what you get, statistically, is exactly what we see today. Roughly 2 out of every 100 people on Earth, carrying, quite literally, in the color of their eyes, the visible fingerprint of one ancient accident that happened to one person in one specific place 10,000 years ago. So if you have green eyes, or you know someone who does, think about everything that had to happen for that exact eye color to exist. It started with one random genetic accident in one single human being somewhere near the Black Sea region, roughly 10,000 years ago. A tiny mistake in DNA copying that nobody could have predicted would eventually spread across an entire continent. That mutation then got passed down, generation after generation, possibly boosted along the way by sunlight adaptation, possibly boosted by nothing more than ancient humans simply finding unusual eyes attractive, or perhaps even helping early tribes quietly recognize their own. Then on top of that ancient foundation, a delicate stack of additional genetic variants had to land in a very specific, narrow combination, rare enough that only about 2% of the entire human population ends up with it today. And for centuries after that, people who ended up with this rare genetic combination were sometimes feared as witches, sometimes worshipped as lucky, sometimes whispered about as having a connection to fairies or the supernatural, sometimes turned into a symbol of jealousy in a Shakespeare play, and sometimes turned into a beauty standard. People now spend money trying to imitate with contact lenses, all without a single person, for most of human history, understanding that the real answer was quietly sitting inside 2 genes on chromosome 15 the entire time. That torchlit night in that Scottish village, that terrified woman being dragged out of her home because of her eyes, she had absolutely no idea that centuries later, scientists in laboratories with microscopes and DNA sequencers would finally prove that her eyes weren't a curse, weren't a connection to the devil, and weren't proof of witchcraft at all. They were simply the rare, beautiful end result of an ancient genetic accident that had been quietly traveling through human bloodlines for 10,000 years, finally landing by pure chance in her. The witch hunters were wrong. The fear was wrong. But the fascination, honestly, that part was completely justified, because green eyes really are one of the rarest, strangest, and most genetically fascinating traits the human body can produce. And now, finally, after thousands of years of myth, folklore, fear, and misunderstanding, we actually know exactly why, and the real explanation, hidden quietly in our DNA all along, turned out to be far stranger and far more remarkable than anything the old legends ever imagined.